Hello and welcome to the peripheral nervous system. Here we'll be looking at the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and we'll consider a few spinal reflex pathways. So recall that nerves are bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system. However, these axons either have their axon terminals within the central nervous system if they are sensory neurons taking information into the CNS, or if they are motor neurons, their cell bodies originate in the central nervous system and their axons exit the CNS and become part of the nerves. From the brain, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are numbered with Roman numerals, which you need to know, and they each have individual names. So you are responsible to match the Roman numeral name and the name, if you will. Now, some cranial nerves carry only sensory neurons, so those are considered sensory cranial nerves. Others contain only motor neurons, and others are mixed, meaning that they contain both sensory and motor fibers. Most of this is self-study, so I'm going to go over it quickly. The notes are quite clear. I've also provided a summary table under weekly learning assignments. Please refer to it. This is the inferior view of the brain and the brainstem in particular, which shows you the origin for the 12 cranial nerves. They are listed on the right. The first letter of the name of each cranial nerve can be used to create a memory aid to help you learn and remember the cranial nerves in order. So this is my little ditty. O, 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 to touch and feel. Very good vacuum, a Hoover. So that little rhyme is made up of the first letters of each of the cranial nerves in order from 1 to 12. You can come up with your own or check the internet for others. You might find one that you prefer better. Let's go through them quickly. This is just an anterior view showing you the origin of a few of the cranial nerves. We have 2 associated with the cerebrum, that's 1 and 2. 3 and 4 associated with the midbrain. 5 through 8 are associated with the pons, and part of 8 through 12 are associated with the medulla. Number 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is purely sensory for smell and projects just beneath the cerebrum where the fibers converge in a structure called the olfactory bulb. Number 2 is the optic nerve. It is also purely sensory. It originates with cells in the retina called ganglion cells, which carry information from photoreceptors in the eye into the brain along this optic nerve. So it is the nerve of vision. The pathway for vision ends in the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobes in the cerebrum. We'll look at that pathway later. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor, which is the third O of the OOO. It is purely motor, so the olfactory number 1 and optic number 2 were purely sensory. The oculomotor is purely motor, so it's carrying signals out of the brain to various structures. Specifically, the somatic motor branches supply 4 of the 6 skeletal muscles that control eye movement. So they're called the extrinsic eye muscles because they're outside of the eyeball, but attached to it and help to move the eye. The autonomic motor fibers are part of the parasympathetic nervous system division. So they are PSNS autonomic motor, and they innervate one set of the intrinsic eye muscles, and these are the ones that constrict the pupil to reduce the amount of light entering the eye. Please note that the oculomotor nerve is associated with or send signals from the midbrain. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear. It is also purely motor, as is the oculomotor, but it is purely somatic motor. It is the smallest of the cranial nerves. It also originates in the midbrain, and it innervates another set of extrinsic eye muscles that move the eyeball. So far the oculomotor and trochlear are 2 of the 3 cranial nerves that move the eyes. Number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It is the largest of the cranial nerves. Its origins are in the pons, and it is mixed. So it has both motor and sensory axons. There are 3 branches: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Its sensory function receives information about touch, pain, and pressure, as well as temperature, coming from the skin of the face. So it's sensory for the skin of the face, as well as the nasal cavity, the pharynx or the throat, the tongue, and the mouth. So any sensory information coming from your head essentially travels into the brain along the trigeminal nerve. The motor axons send signals to or innervate the muscles of mastication, the main one being the masseter muscle in the cheek or buccal area. So the trigeminal nerve plays a large role in chewing. Number 6 is the abducens nerve. It is related to the oculomotor and trochlear in that it is purely motor, and it innervates another set of extrinsic eye muscles that move or abduct the eyeball, rotating it laterally on either side. So your 3 eye movers are the oculomotor number 3, the trochlear number 4, and the abducens nerve. Also note that the abducens is one of the nerves that originates from the pons. Moving on to number 7, which is the facial nerve. The facial nerve should not be confused with the trigeminal. The facial nerve is also mixed. Its sensory portion extends from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and is sensory for taste. Its motor aspects, however, are to the muscles of the face for facial expression. It also has autonomic motor fibers, which are part of the PSNS division, that stimulate production and flow of saliva. So it's motor for salivation, and it's motor to the lacrimal glands in the eye sockets for producing tears or lacrimation. So even though it's called a facial nerve, it is motor facial, while the trigeminal nerve is sensory facial, if that makes sense. The vestibulocochlear nerve is number 8. Now this nerve is also large. Part of it originates in the pons and the other part in the medulla. It is purely sensory, but it is sensory for 2 types of sensations. It is associated with receptors in your inner ear. Those along the vestibular branch carry impulses from the ear into the brain for equilibrium. Vestibular goes with equilibrium, while the cochlear branch is associated with receptors in the cochlear structure of the ear and is sensory for hearing. So these signals will eventually project to the auditory cortex in the thalamus. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and even though we're referring to only one nerve, please recall that they occur in pairs on either side of the brain. Cranial nerve 9 is a mixed cranial nerve. It is sensory for taste buds in the posterior third of the tongue, so it is sensory for taste, as is the facial nerve. They both work together with respect to that function. It is also sensory for receptors located in the carotid artery of the neck. These include baroreceptors for blood pressure and chemoreceptors for blood chemistry, such as oxygen levels, pH, etc. Those are very important autonomic sensory functions. The glossopharyngeal nerve is also motor. It contains autonomic motor fibers that extend to the salivary glands to stimulate the release of saliva or salivation. That was another common function with the facial nerve. And it contains somatic motor neurons that signal the muscles of the larynx and pharynx for swallowing. Moving on to cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. Please note the proper spelling of this vagus. This is not like Vegas out in Nevada in the States. This is cranial nerve 10, VAGUS. Now this is another large and very important cranial nerve. It is also mixed and originates from the medulla. It has axons that receive signals from and extend to a large region of the body, all the way down to the thorax and abdomen. Let's look at the sensory branches. The sensory fibers deal with a variety of sensations. So similar to the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve also receives signals from baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, but these are located in the aorta, which is the major artery branching off the heart. So this would be within the thoracic region. Its somatic sensory function is from the muscles of the neck and the throat. And autonomic sensory also includes receptors in most of the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So even though we are not consciously aware or able to localize very well sensations coming from our internal organs, they do have receptors that send signals into the brain, most of them along the vagus nerve. The motor aspects of the vagus nerve again arise from the medulla and supply the skeletal muscles of the pharynx, larynx, and soft palate, that's the roof of your mouth, that are involved in swallowing, similar to the glossopharyngeal, but also for vocalization. That is the ability to form distinguishable sounds like I am doing right now to provide this lecture. Most importantly, if I may say so, is the autonomic motor function arising from the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is responsible for about 80% of all of the PSNS or parasympathetic nervous system output in the central nervous system. The PSNS branches of the vagus nerve extend to the heart to slow its rate of contraction, extend to glands of the gastrointestinal tract or your digestive tract, and the smooth muscle of the respiratory passageways and digestive organs. So this cranial nerve is a major PSNS nerve. So in this diagram, we can see the origins of the vagus nerve in the medulla and how it has several branches that extend from the face all the way down to the digestive tract. That's a very important nerve. And again, most of its output is PSNS or autonomic motor, or a better way to say that is most of the PSNS motor output is along the vagus nerve. The second last nerve is the accessory nerve, number 11. This is an interesting nerve. It is purely motor. It has origins in the medulla as well as contributing fibers from spinal nerves C1 through C5. So as it leaves the central nervous system, the fibers sort into the cranial accessory nerve and the spinal accessory nerve branches. To summarize, its main function is to provide fibers to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles that move the head. So damage to the accessory nerve will result in the inability to raise or rotate the head. And finally, the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, which also is purely motor, originating from the medulla, sends nerve signals to the tongue for speech or articulation, as did the vagus, as well as to the mouth for swallowing. So purely motor, somatic motor for speech and swallowing. And that ends the cranial nerves.